Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, the bull market support band for Bitcoin has continued to rise because the price of Bitcoin is still well above both the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. The 20-week SMA for Bitcoin is now just above $81,000. The 21-week EMA is just above $84,000. So it essentially ranges from 81 to 84K. Now, the lowest we've really seen Bitcoin go essentially for all of December and at least half of January so far is around that $90,000 mark. So we've seen Bitcoin go as low as just above $90,000. We have, of course, made the comparisons to last year at this time when Bitcoin also had a move up in October and November and then was relatively flat for a couple of months. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked about this, right? We said, look, guys, one of the potential paths here that is at least somewhat likely was after you get this move, you could easily see Bitcoin go sideways for a month or two, and that would be sort of a realistic outcome, right? That's exactly what happened last year. Now, you will note that last year, Bitcoin didn't even make it to its bull market support band before it got another leg higher. So it is important to remember that, but also it's important to remember that not that it has to happen again, but it did go to the 100-day moving average before getting a bounce, right? And so the 100-day moving average today is around 86K. Now, I don't know if this is going to happen, but in some of the ranges that we've seen, you'll set like sort of an early wick, and then eventually you'll see Bitcoin sweep that wick, right? So you set the sort of the range low there, and then eventually you sweep it, also coincidentally at the 100-day moving average in May of 2024. You could argue that this is the range low up here at 90K, kind of like how you had something similar here at 40K. But even back then, eventually it went below that range low. And I do wonder, could you go below the range low and sort of sweep that wick? Always a possibility. Now, I do want people to be aware that just because Bitcoin bounced off the 100-day moving average last year doesn't mean that it has to this year, right? It certainly doesn't mean that it has to. And in fact, there's no such thing as a sure thing in the market, right? There's always a chance it just breaks below the 100-day moving average. But when you're trying to come up with sort of realistic outlooks and whatnot, it always was relevant to make the comparison to 2024, January of 2024. Now, you can also make comparisons to other years. And one of the things that we've mentioned is if you actually just look at prior post halving years, you'll notice that Bitcoin got 30% corrections around that January timeframe, right? So in 2021, Bitcoin dropped around 31% or so. In 2017, Bitcoin also had a fairly significant drop. I think it dropped around 35% or so. And it also found support at the 100-day moving average. So that's always a relevant thing to consider. We could also talk about, market cycle theory and left translated versus right translated. And obviously, there's a lot of discourse right now from a lot of people talking about whether the top is in or not. The reality is no one knows. But it's always important to sort of keep in mind the most realistic outcomes, right? And in the case where this is a local top for a while, it's not going to be obvious for a long time, right? If instead of this, we're already sort of repeating this, it wouldn't be obvious for a while, and at least that would be my guess. Um, but I think that one of the things you also have to consider when just sort of thinking about most likely outcomes in post halving years is, I think a lot of people just sort of think of what happened in 2021, but not all post-halving years get started off like 2021 did, right? So in 2021, Bitcoin almost immediately went up 27%, right? And then it dropped and then it went up, 2x or so within the first 100 days. But if you look at 2017, you'll notice that Bitcoin actually sold off initially, right? It actually sold off fairly early on, and it did rally up about 11%, but ultimately it dropped from the yearly open about 23%. Now, if you overlay 2025, you can see that Bitcoin in 2025 has actually been holding up a little bit better than it was holding up in 2017, right? Um, but it is interesting to think about the market in that way. If you were to look at 2013, you'll notice that Bitcoin didn't really get that big of a drop down, although it didn't really go anywhere the first couple of weeks of January. So I also think, you could look at a number of things, right? You could also look at the cycle ROI from the low and see that all things considered, Bitcoin is more or less right where it always is around this point in the cycle. In fact, if you overlay this cycle with the 2016-2017 cycle, you can see there was a correction around this time in the 2016-2017 cycle. I think the biggest question, right, that a lot of people have is what does the future hold? I really do wish I had a crystal ball to tell you. What I would say is that the best thing you can do is just try to manage your risk appropriately. And it means having a plan no matter what happens, right? I use the risk levels, and when they're low, I buy, and when they go up pretty high, I start to sell. And that way I don't really stress too much about, where the market's going to go in the short term, because I recognize that it is somewhat unpredictable. The one thing I would say, going back to Bitcoin, is that eventually checking in with the 100-day moving average seems like a somewhat likely scenario, right? Whether it happens today or tomorrow or, 2 weeks from now, it's hard to say, but it seems like a somewhat likely scenario. And one potential outcome is just the 100-day moving average sort of comes up to the price of Bitcoin. It seems like that is a likely scenario at some point. And if it holds the support and we get another leg higher, like last year, then great, right? Great. But it's also important to remember that the market can throw us curveballs. And worst case short term outlook would be in my view, would be to retest the breakout point, right? And I don't say that lightly, and I don't really, and I look at it, I'm like, does it really need to happen? And the answer is no. But the one reason I at least put it on your radar is because if you look at Bitcoin after the election, it had this rally, right? It had sort of the rally started right there, and it's come all the way up, and now it's kind of just leveled off for the last couple of months, right? It really hasn't gone higher. And the only reason I mention this is because if you actually look at the S&P 500, you'll notice that this is where it was at the election, and you can see it's basically returned to back where it was at the election, right? You see that? And if you look at the Russell, you can see that this is where it was at the election, and now it is returned to below where it was at the election. And so there's two ways to think about that, right? One way is to say, well, maybe it means that Bitcoin is also going to make the same move, right? That's the sort of the glass half empty approach, is that, well, Bitcoin is probably going to make that same move. But the counterpoint is to say Bitcoin, you know, historically has held up better than the stock market in bull markets, right? That it goes up a lot more than the stock market. But because it doesn't get those, intermediate corrections as much as the S&P, then whenever the bear market does finally hit, that's why crypto ends up selling off 70, 80%. And the stock market, doesn't normally go down nearly as much, right? Sometimes 20% or 30%, but you don't often see the S&P dropping, 50, 60%. And I mean, how often have you ever seen the S&P drop 80%, right? I mean, you'd have to go back maybe even to, to the Great Depression to see something like that. So, I guess that's sort of a more optimistic way to look at it, but we've seen that pattern before where you have sort of a a lower high structure that Bitcoin eventually breaks out of, and then it sort of immediately tests it as support and then goes higher. Sometimes you'll see it, test it again on a more macro scale. But the only way that I could see that really happening, I guess there's a couple ways. If you had inflation coming in really hot, or you had the unemployment rate come in a lot higher than people think, then it's always possible that something like that could happen. Or the other thing is if the 10-year yield continues to rally for too much longer, eventually it could cause Bitcoin to sort of sell off more. Because in 2023, as we talked about before, right, when Bitcoin broke out of the lower high structure, right, when the 10-year yield broke out of the lower high structure, it lasted, essentially for about 70 days. And right now, if you make a similar comparison, you can see that the 10-year yield has been going up for about 25 days. So if we do have to endure the 10-year yield heading higher for a little bit longer, then of course that is a headwind for risk assets. The reason I mention that is if you look at 2023 and you look at Bitcoin, well, it actually had a very similar move where it had a move up, but then eventually it just broke back down to where the initial move up started from. You see that? And of course, it was happening, that move back down occurred on the rally of the 10-year yield. So if Bitcoin does have to kind of return back to where it was when the election happened, I'm saying it has to, but if it were to return back there, then it actually would look somewhat similar to that move there, where you get a move up, it goes sideways, and then it drops back down, and then you wait, you see the 10-year yield top up there, right? The 10-year yield tops, and that's where then Bitcoin went up again, because the 10-year yield was topping, but you weren't actually in a recession. So that is kind of a something to consider here, because, and I'm watching the 10-year yield pretty closely because I do think it has, fairly strong implications for the market. So those are my general views right now. Before you even have to deal with something like that, though, even, you have the 100-day, you have, just the support structure, right? You got a lot of different things to look at, but you also have the bull market support band. So if Bitcoin were to drop back down there, it would also imply dropping beneath the bull market support band, which is something that it has done this cycle a couple of times, but the two times it occurred was actually in Q3 of those years, right? It was the third quarter of the year, not the first or second. In fact, in both 2023 and 2024, Bitcoin essentially spent all of Q1 and Q2 above the bull market support band. And it wasn't until the third quarter that Bitcoin, actually fell below it. But yeah, you can kind of see a similar structure back over there in 2023 when the 10-year yield, was breaking out. Bitcoin had to move up, right? It had that move up, but then it basically just, it set a range low for a little while, right? But then eventually it fell below it, and then eventually it had a larger drop. Okay, so it makes sense, obviously, to compare the range low here in January 2024 with the one in January of 2025. But I also don't want people to get blinded by that single outcome, because there was an example in 2023 around the same time that the 10-year yield broke out, which is exactly what's happening right now, where it actually eventually got just below the range low, and then it fell below the bull market support band back to where it previously took off from. You see that? Back to where it took off from. And then it found support there for a little while, and then it moved up again. So that's another way to think about the market, right? And again, it doesn't have to be one of those things where you have to guess necessarily. I would say if you get a quick move down by Bitcoin to the 100-day moving average, and then it bounces strongly off that, it would imply that this is the more relevant analog. If, on the other hand, Bitcoin slowly drops below it and then just kind of stays just below the range low like that, kind of like it did right there, then the implication is that it looks more like 2023, where then it could get that drop back down, maybe find support there, and then figure out the next move. Okay, so that I think is what you should be looking at with the market right now to try to figure out the most likely scenarios in the short term. If you guys like the content, again, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.